With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, this is going to be fun. Let's talk a little bit about the interwebs, more specifically how people want to get their fingers into them and control them, and other people do not want them to do that. Normally, I'd say we're going over to the UK, but she happens to be stateside right now, but she is one of our great UK Young Voices contributors. She is the public affairs manager for Net Choice, a great organization. She has done a lot of other work at places you would know when you go read her bio at youngvoices.com. Kir Nuthi, how are you, my friend?
Good. How are you?
I am thrilled to have you. We've been trying to do this for a week or two, so fun to finally get you in. You've been talking a lot about the internet, specifically regulation. Let's start big picture before we go delving into some of the specifics here. People want to throw around some terminology when we deal with the internet now. They want to talk about antitrust. They want to talk about competition. Part of the problem here, though, is in things like antitrust, especially the way it's written in the U.S. law. I don't know about overseas. These are things that were really designed for the last century and the old business models, and I'm not sure they completely fit the new paradigm that we're in of the internet. And yet this seems to be the tool that legislators and regulators want to pull out of the tool bag. I got all kinds of doubts whether that's appropriate or not on a lot of levels, but you've been writing about it. You've been explaining it to folks. How do you feel when you hear that word antitrust getting thrown around about the internet?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. You're seeing a lot of different perspectives in Europe as well as in the US on how to regulate companies, especially online companies. And what we're seeing, at least on the American side, is the word antitrust is getting thrown around for antitrust proposals by US senators and US representatives to change how America treats antitrust law. You're seeing the same thing at the European Union, and now you're seeing the same thing in the United Kingdom. All three seem to be focusing explicitly on online tech companies and online services that promote social media. For the US, it seems to be an approach that disregards consumers, even though we have the consumer welfare standard here. In the US, we have that consumer welfare standard to make sure that consumers are the first focus of competitive markets. The question is, are consumers being benefited by these online services? Are they being benefited by the business practices of companies? If so, it's probably above board. For the UK and the EU, they have a little bit of a different approach for competition. But the approach that they're currently doing is kind of the same. They're focusing on social media companies because they think that they are anti-competitive in a way that just disregards consumers of the UK and the EU and will have aftershocks in the US the same way the US policy will have aftershocks in the UK and EU.
And we're already seeing I don't know how you'd call it, a divide, a pulling away here. I was shocked about this when you were writing about this. You had this stat, and this blew me away. Spotify is the only top 30 tech company based in the EU. That can't be true. I mean, that just doesn't even sound right, does it?
It doesn't. And it's really interesting considering that like the startup and scale up culture of Europe and the United Kingdom post-Brexit are both ramping up. It just seems off that it's just Spotify by market capitalization. But I think that's a sign of how light touch regulation or the way that American tech companies have been able to succeed is working. Light touch regulation made it so that an awkward statement like Spotify is really the only large competitive tech company, according to market cap, is possible. And it's because one side of the Atlantic had light touch regulation that let these companies have low barriers to entry and focus on innovation and disrupting the status quo. Whereas the other side had already heightened barriers to entry and already had a lot of hurdles that startups and companies have to just get past to even be competitive in the international environment. And that is what the internet is. It's an international environment. These companies have global reaches sometimes. And because they have global reaches, a European company is going to compete with American ones, and American one's going to compete with Asian ones.
It's so interesting though, because this isn't like we're talking about, developing nations here. Germany, France, Germany's one of the world leaders in industrial technology. They're on the cutting edge of that. Most of the world goes there for things like, precision tooling, things like this that you need for industrial thing. Switzerland, of course, world renowned for their banking and their financing stuff. The Netherlands, Spain, Sweden. These aren't developing countries. These are what we would consider frontline economies, top countries in the world, countries that are mostly market-based systems that we think of as being pretty free. The idea that there isn't a major tech company in a Germany or in a Switzerland or even in an England, London's the financial center of the world in a lot of cases, as we've learned with the Russian stuff. That's just shocking to me. But is that not a perfect example of what a little bit of regulation can do? Because we've all seen the European websites where we got to click those extra cookie things, right? And that's not exactly analogous, but it's just an example. Is there any other way to explain that but regulation? Because they innovate in everything else. They just don't seem to be innovating in this.
I mean, you're seeing that now post-Brexit. The United Kingdom post-Brexit is outpacing Germany, France, Sweden, all of these countries for like startup investment, venture capital, etc. Like, it's become a real contender, and it's going to be really interesting to see in the coming years if that works out for the United Kingdom, because they've maintained the approach that makes them more marketable than Europe. But that's the exact reason why the UK was even able to outpace European countries, is their regulatory system, especially their data privacy, GDPR, has made it not the most friendly area for tech companies to want to go to or start their business. And that's just the nature of free markets and competition. While the European Union may want a heavily regulated environment, and maybe that is what they want, and maybe that isn't what they want, but that's what they have. Companies can just go elsewhere, so can investors. And while customers can probably not move as easily as companies and investment, it's going to always be more consumer friendly and more investment friendly, more innovation friendly, where there is less regulation.
Now, you went to school in London. You went to University College of London. You know London well. London is an international city. It's the financial hub for most of the world. It's also a cultural hub. There's the running joke that all the most expensive real estate in London, none of it is owned by the English. It's all, rich people from elsewhere coming in. Talk about the environment though. Like, do people in London, do they go, well, wait a minute, we're a financial center, we're one of the great cities in the world, shouldn't we have this? Or is that something that the people think of, and therefore, because it's a parliamentarian system, the government is just kind of lagging behind it? Or is the government ahead of the people there in England?
I don't know myself, actually. I think what we're seeing in the UK is they want to start this digital markets unit to create regulation, and they want to force the Competitive Markets Authority to be a little bit more aggressive than maybe it was in the past. But it's interesting. I feel like when I lived there, and just in general, London is an incredibly unique city, just because it is so large and holds so many industries and just so many different like sectors of talent. But for the United Kingdom, it seems to be that they're pushing for regulation after having to figure out what the regulatory scheme looks like, especially for digital markets. The European Union created the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. They now have the Data Act, and now the Competition and Markets Authority and the UK government have thought about what a pro-competition regime for digital markets is for the United Kingdom. Maybe there's a little bit of like UK pride there. But what we are seeing is the United Kingdom creating what is their own regulatory system to compete with the US and the EU. And I'm not sure who's to say which one works, but I do think we'll be able to tell which one is more pro-competitive based off of how much consumer choice exists.
Yeah, talking to Kir Nuthi. Before we jump back to this side of the pond, let's stay with England for just a second. Obviously, Europe is busy with things like Russia, their war of aggression into Ukraine. But isn't the war in Ukraine another good example of how we need to be really, really careful with regulation of the internet? Because you have things, some of the best news we're getting out of Ukraine is off of TikTok, and it's off citizen journalists using social media. Telegram, which is not as well known in the States, Telegram is making that thing work over there right now. Things like this. How is people getting a realization of like, oh, this isn't just cat pictures and yelling at our government? This social media thing has some real world consequences. And when we have something like what's going on in Ukraine, where the internet is basically the lifeline for the country outside of the actual fighting arms, is there a sense in Europe and the UK, are they starting to take that lesson and go, okay, this is something we need to protect? Or do you think the governments are going, okay, this is something we need to continue to regulate, and they're just missing the point here?
I I don't know. You see that like in Ukraine and the way that the tech companies have responded, that it is a rapid response game. Like you are trying to deal with a horrible, horrible situation as best as humans can. And I don't mean to laugh at that. It's an awful weight. It's just an awful weight on everyone's shoulders. And I really wish it didn't happen. But what you are also seeing is these companies are facing content moderation regulations in the United Kingdom and possibly as well in the EU that would make the Ukrainian response they had that much harder. The online safety bill, which is a proposal to regulate content moderation of social media and what can or cannot be said online in the United Kingdom, will change the game. And God forbid there's another situation like Ukraine, it could make it a lot harder to have that rapid and necessary and empathetic response that Ukrainians needed, but also the rest of Europe needed to know how to get their news and make sure that incredibly valid and incredibly horrific content was still being communicated actively and with mitigated misinformation, etc.
We're talking to Kir Nuthi, another one of our great Young Voices contributors. She's the managing public affairs manager of Net Choice. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to get on this side of the pond. She happens to be sitting in DC at the current moment. We're going to talk a little U.S. politics, how our Congress is dealing with things. Also continue to talk about the internet, freedom, regulation, things like this. Kir Nuthi continues with us on Heard Tell right after this. Welcome back to Heard Tell. We're having a great conversation with Kir Nuthi, another Young Voices contributor. Okay, we talked about that you did some of your schooling over in London. You also went to UC San Diego, so you're a world traveler. You got both ends of that covered. Let's talk the U.S. a little bit. Our Congress seems to be utterly obsessed with big tech. I get why on the one level, because let's just admit the elephant in the room. Big tech makes a really good bad guy. It makes good fundraising. It makes good politics. It makes good optics. But you actually study this stuff. You know what you're talking about. When you see these hearings that our Congress, our Senate, or the House of Representatives, whatever the case may be, it looks to us really bad optically that they have no clue what they're talking about when they're quizzing the experts that they bring in. You are one of those experts, though. Is it as bad to you when you review it as it is to us that, wow, they get off their talking points, they have no idea how the internet works?
I do always wonder how close some of our Congress people are to the internet. Like I myself, I manage Net Choice's social media, and I am not up to date on some of the new social media. I'm not the age demographic for how TikTok functions. I watch the videos and could not make one myself because I could not understand the back end. And that's just kind of the nature of the internet, is there are different places for different people. But what worries me most about Congress and their like laser focus on social media and online technology is that their laser focus on social media is going to overturn the one thing that I truly believe made the internet so competitive and so innovative. If we do not have an internet that puts consumers first, or like have an internet ecosystem that protects American innovation, what does that mean in the grand scheme of things? Is that going to mean that consumers are going to have to have less choices? Is that going to mean that prices are going to be driven up? Is that going to mean that we have not thought about the consequences of these legislation and these like proposals that Congress is pushing through? And when I read the bills, I do genuinely worry that the consequences of the foreseen actions, if enacted, aren't being thought about, because a lot of them focus on overturning the consumer welfare standard. A lot of them focus on targeting by market capitalization and regulating by very specific criteria that can easily expand to every industry in the American economy. Like, we are talking about bills that are so wide reaching and so expansive that the FTC, the DOJ, and Congress can do what they want with them. And that in and of itself just sounds like ballooning big government to me.
Yeah, omnibus bills without real specific language are always bad for freedom. I agree with you there. Look, we could talk about the regulation and the data points and the stats. Let's try to do just a real world example for everybody here real quick. They're focused on Facebook for a lot of reasons. One is because Facebook is the big company. Two is Facebook is the first company in the history of ever that is spending millions and millions of dollars to try to get themselves regulated, which throws up all kinds of red flags in my mind, but we'll talk about that some other time. Here's my issue with regulation in general, and you can apply this to a lot of things, but tech especially because it moves so fast. My teenagers, Facebook's the thing you use to talk to old people. Like, Facebook is already like 2 tech innovations ago, really, because they're already on the TikTok, they're already on to Discord, they're already on to all these other things that they actually use to talk to their peers. In 5 years, when they're adults, they're not really going to have anything to do with Facebook, I don't think, other than to talk to grandma and their mother and whoever else. The shift is happening faster than the regulation. One of my legitimate concerns, I think, is they're going to write a regulation that's already 5-10 years out of date the second it goes into law. And then what are they going to do? I mean, just on a practical level, we talk about all these stats and stuff. There's no way they can regulate to keep up with the innovation, is there?
I mean, you're seeing that in these bills. Like, Facebook's an amazing example of this. When Facebook's market capitalization went down a couple weeks ago, the American Innovation and Choice Online Act, Senator Klobuchar's bill, lost its ability, or not lost its ability, but almost looked like Facebook wouldn't be covered. That, like, these markets change so dramatically because of multi-homing, because of generational gappage. Like, I don't know what generation I am, but I do know that millennials and whatever I am, we focus on Twitter. We grew up on Facebook, but like, all of the people younger than us are on TikTok and have taught us Discord. And the thing I spent my entire teenage years on, Tumblr, is not a website I've touched in a decade. These companies come and go, these websites come and go because generations pick and choose the mediums they want to talk about. Like, I guarantee that when I'm 50, the things that I say I did online will not be the things that like my kids or my friends' kids will be saying and doing online. It's just generational growth and generational evolution. And you're seeing that in the online world the same way you see it in the offline world. What you're also seeing is just multi-homing. Like, TikTok is where I go for entertainment content. Twitter is where I go to rant online. Facebook is where I go to communicate with family that I don't really communicate with very often. Each of these platforms has a different use for a different person. Like, the way that my coworkers may use Facebook is probably completely different than the way I use it. And it's probably completely different than the way you use it. And it's going to be the same for people older and younger than us. And that's almost a sign of competition, because we get to pick what services we use. I use Discord more than I use Facebook, and I wouldn't have said that last year. That's because I chose to use a platform that my friends are on and I got taught. And a year from now, who knows? Maybe I'll back on Facebook. Maybe I'm on some new service that doesn't even exist yet. And that's just nice to have the options for change.
You know, when that really hit me was when my 2 younger kids, when they were a little bit younger, and we got back because we were living overseas, and we got back to the States, and because they were used to watching things on DVD and stuff. This is before streaming got really big, and they started watching TV for the first time as younger kids, and they got viscerally angry at commercials. Like they didn't understand because they were just because we were in Germany. They were used to just watching everything on DVD because that's all streaming wasn't quite as what it is now. They're like, what are these commercials? Why are they interrupting my show? We're 15 years down the line from that, where people, like, I know it's a small example, but they're talking about things. I don't think folks understand the generational swings. I know, like, when last time I was on Young Turks, they had me on, and I was just talking to the producers off air, and they're like, oh yeah, our biggest push right now is getting on Discord. Like they're really focusing on stream. Like they're like, that's where everything is, because that's our demo. They used to talk about the key demographic, that 25 to 40. Well, the 25 to 40 is all on Discord gaming, and they're all on TikTok getting their videos, and they use YouTube to pick and choose their entertainment options. I'll put my hand up. Look, I never had a social media account until 4 years ago when I started writing publicly. I got a Twitter account and on Facebook. I had to learn all this stuff from scratch, from knowing nothing. I have a YouTube channel. You're on it right now. Hopefully, please subscribe, hit the button. But that's the whole point, is like, even the people that do this can't keep up with it. This wide-ranging legislation, like you're saying, I'm really worried they're just going to end up making these open door kind of regulations where they're just going to be able to come in and shut down anything they want for any reason they want, and have no understanding the economic impact or the freedom impact. Because I'm going to say it this way, you tell me if I'm oversimplifying it, I really do believe the internet is one of the greatest tools in the history of humanity for freedom. It really is. And you have the entire depth and breadth of the human knowledge in your fingertips, and you can talk to anybody in the world about it. And I don't see any way that regulation is going to do anything but lessen that. Am I wrong?
I mean, that's exactly how I think about it. When I think about even just growing up as the internet was becoming a thing and as social media was becoming a thing, the amount of information I was able to touch when I was like 12 or 13 is nowhere compared to how much I can like learn about and relate to online now. And if I had the resources that like college students and teenagers have now, I'd feel a lot more related to in some of my angsty years. And that's just a really silly example, but like for communities that need resources, the internet has it. Those communities, it would be really hard to. Like a real world example of this is I did not know a lot about my culture, and without Reddit, without the internet, without Netflix and all of these online services, I wouldn't know how robust my heritage was. Like I can almost pinpoint to an exact subreddit this one time in college that finally made me feel seen and gave me a list of resources and movies to watch and things to feel more comfortable with as like a first generation American. I know that's possible because users created the content, because the internet has enabled users to love and create online. Granted, there's some bad things with that, and some of that is heinous, and yes, it needs to be taken down. Content moderation is a really vibrant discussion that we all need to continuously have, but user-created content was really important for me. User-created content is going to be really important for teenagers looking for resources. Like minority and queer communities and first-generation Americans, I 100% believe can use the internet for good, to be related to feel empathized with, to create a community where they may not have one at home or offline. I know that to be true for me. I know that's going to be true for them. Where these bills go wrong is deciding that that needs to be regulated, be that through content moderation regulation or worse, antitrust regulation. The antitrust regulation that we're seeing now is just so vague and loose and gives a lot of power to places like the FTC, which is just like code for unelected bureaucrat, which makes it so that government gets to pick what companies can do and what bills can target. So while that'll affect the internet, it'll definitely affect user-created content and will definitely affect internet companies if enacted. But what it will also do is it's going to affect any industry that these unelected bureaucrats choose next. So while the in vogue thing is to get upset with social media, and there are valid reasons to get upset with social media, what happens when bureaucrats turn somewhere else with this exact legislation? We've basically just given them a vague roadmap to do what they want and enforce what they want. That's not great.
Yeah, I love what you said about the cultural aspect of this, because I had it happen to me recently where I'm researching a long-term project I'm writing on, something that literally happened a half mile from the house I grew up with, where my parents still live, up yonder, the top of our mountain in West Virginia, where we've been there for 200 years, our family. And I found out something that happened on the backside of that very mountain. I figured it out on the internet. And I called my dad and asked him about it. And he's like, "Oh, yeah, I already knew about that," because dad, meaning his dad, meaning my grandfather, is like, "Oh, yeah, he was there. I know all about it." Like, I wouldn't have known about that if I hadn't found it on the internet. It just blows my mind. Kir Nuthi, let's put a bow on it this way. When you look at it, because you're doing this as a policy perspective, what can the average person do? Because call your senator doesn't really work. Tweet your senator, or Discord your senator, whatever we're doing nowadays. Let's be real. That has limited value. How should people be, because they are online, especially if they're watching this program, they're online, unless they're on the radio. How do they actually advocate for freedom online? How do they do it with just their regular social media content and what they're generating themselves? Because people don't think of themselves as content creators, but they really are, because you can go viral for anything nowadays, right? How do they just work that into what they're already doing when they're doing a Facebook post, when they're doing a tweet, when they're doing whatever that is they're doing online? How do they work in their own advocacy for a free and open internet in a practical way, do you think?
I think it's really important when we're advocating for free speech and just free enterprise online, is to use the free speech and free enterprise online. It sounds a little counterintuitive and hokey, but like acknowledging that we can have healthy and honest and happy conversations online, and we can use the tools that are given, and we can move off of platforms we don't like, is a great first step. We don't need to get resentful of our online lives. We don't need to feel like our online lives are forced upon us. And that's just step one of making sure that your own personal free speech is yours and you have autonomy over it. But number two is just figuring out how to support free speech and free enterprise online. It's okay if you disagree with someone on Twitter, and acknowledging that on Twitter ensures that you have better discourse. It also ensures that people don't feel like all of a sudden big government needs to get in to your conversations. That's just an easy way to go about it. Another easy way to go about it isn't to call your senator, but to acknowledge that all of us need to stay up to date on what this legislation means. Like, calling Senator Klobuchar might not work. Maybe it does, and I ideally hope it does. But just knowing what those bills are going to mean for you is going to make sure that you can stay on an internet you love. Knowing how these antitrust bills will affect Amazon Prime. There's hundreds and hundreds of articles online by amazing policy scholars that will teach you or explain to you or send you to more resources that will make sure you have informed choices. Like, if you know what this bill is going to do, then you know exactly why you don't want it. And you can share that with your friends, you can post about it, or you can just re-up it when a conversation goes in a way that might promote bad policy ideas.
Yeah, it's sad to say, but I'd like to cite this, but I can't remember who said it on Twitter one time. They said probably the only thing saving free speech online is that people like Amazon and Facebook a lot more than they like people in Washington, D.C. And that might be the only thing that saves us here. But let's be a little more proactive than that. Kir Nuthi, you have been an amazing guest. I love this conversation. We will definitely have you back, because this issue is not going to go away. It's only going to accelerate. Until we get you back on the program, can you let folks know where they can find you on your social media and your writing and the things you do for Net Choice and Young Voices?
Yeah, my online life is at Kir Nuthi on Twitter, and basically at Kir Nuthi on everything. But you can find me at Net Choice, where we focus on a lot of American digital policy. But yeah.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to have you back. I appreciate your time so much, especially since we took 2 weeks trying to get you booked and get you in, and then we finally got it done. Thank you so much. We'll talk again very, very soon. Kir Nuthi, you're amazing. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for having me.
Appreciate it. Thank you, ma'am.